Good afternoon and welcome back to Earth Day Live, our series featuring thought leaders taking meaningful action on environmental issues. I'm your host, Evan Raskin. I lead the national campaign for Earth Day and environmental action every day. I'm absolutely stoked to have you all here with us today. Feel free to write in the comments where you're calling in from, as well as any questions you'd like us to answer during the Q&A. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who couldn't make it today or wants to learn more about this exciting topic. Today's episode is the politics of plastic, where we'll be hearing from elected leaders, including mayors and state representatives, who are working hard to protect you and your loved ones from one of the most universal public health crises of the modern world. Plastic is a global problem demanding a global solution. It's an issue transcending national borders, affecting every community and every citizen on Earth. Plastic can be found on the highest mountains and in the deepest oceans, and even inside our own bodies. Study after study continues to reveal a disturbing trend. If our relationship with plastic doesn't change, there will be an increase in hormone balances, cancers, and heart damage related to plastic production and consumption. Some studies even indicate that plastic exposure can lead to Alzheimer's and reproductive issues. It's not too late, however, for humanity to take a path to a brighter future. During this broadcast, we'll hear from elected officials who are leading the way on plastic and navigating the politics of plastic. Please welcome to the stage State Representative Sophie Phillips and Mayor Robert Gallagher. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves and let the audience know why you're here today, and starting with the mayor.
Thanks, Evan. I appreciate the opportunity to have an MRCTI mayor join you today. My name is Bob Gallagher. I'm the mayor of the city of Bettendorf, Iowa, part of the Quad Cities where I-80 meets the Mississippi River. I'm also the past co-chair of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative.
And hello, everyone. I'm Representative Sophie Phillips from Delaware. I represent the 18th district here, and I'm also the vice chair of the Energy and Natural Resource Committee in the House. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you, Evan, for hosting this.
Oh, it's our absolute pleasure. So let's go ahead and start with you, Mayor Gallagher. You mentioned that you're part of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. Can you tell us a bit more about that organization and how cooperation between cities can lead to better outcomes when it comes to addressing plastic pollution?
I'd be happy to. The mayors of the Mississippi River represent 103 of the cities up and down the entire length of the river, from Bemidji, Minnesota, where we just had our annual meeting last week, to the Gulf of Mexico at New Orleans, Louisiana. The organization was formed in 2012 to provide a common voice for our cities with regard to the Mississippi River. The MRCTI builds the capacity of mayors by empowering them with the tools and support to undertake local initiatives which attract green jobs, move toward sustainable economies, and achieve local environmental protection goals, similar to what we're talking about here in the plastic pollution area. Ultimately, our work with the MRCTI helps protect and restore the Mississippi River as a natural system that can support human culture and economies, as well as the river's unique ecosystem and wildlife. The MRCTI has 5 pillar programs. First, clean water. Second, sustainable economies. Third, disaster resilience and adaptation. Fourth, international food and water security. And fifth, celebration of our river culture, history, and heritage. The Plastic Pollution Initiative falls under the Clean Water Program, obviously.
Wow. Thank you, Mayor Gallagher. It sounds like cooperation between cities through a framework like the MRCTI is incredibly valuable, especially when it comes to conserving common resources like the Mississippi River. And I see that you mentioned that MRCTI just had its annual summit in Bemidji, Minnesota. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happened there? We heard that there was this press conference that contained some exciting plastics-related initiatives. We'd love to hear more about that.
Excuse me. Yeah, we had a great time in Bemidji. Saw Babe and Paul Bunyan. You saw a picture there, I think, of the group in front of Babe, the big blue ox, and Paul Bunyan. But the press conference was kind of twofold. First, the MRCTIs, the whole mayors up and down the river in our communities couldn't be more successful or have any success, quite frankly, without partnerships. And at our annual meeting, we announced a couple of them. We were at the headwaters of the Mississippi River, as you know, and we announced critical conclusions from a great study that we've been working on for years. It it was a partnership, with the United Nations Environmental Program. And we also had two more monumental partnerships that we announced. One with Replenish, which is a company that has an expertise in circularity programs, and a second, first of its kind, alliance with the First Nations, the original stewards of the Mississippi River and the environment in this country. So that hadn't been done before, and we had a great meeting with some folks in Bemidji to announce that great partnership. The first announcement, where we talked about the conclusions from the study that we did, we logged almost 175,000 items using the debris tracker application that was created by the University of Georgia in cooperation with our friends at the United Nations Environmental Program. We used that tracker between April 2021 and June of 2022 for the Mississippi River Plastic Pollution Initiative. We found what was along the riverbanks and the creekways that feed that river, and 75% of those items were plastic. Top items logged included cigarette butts, food wrappers, and beverage bottles, followed by fragments of those things: foam and hard plastic fragments, paper and cardboard, plastic bags, aluminum or tin cans, foam, plastic cups, and film fragments. So we also know by logging that information where that material is coming from. And the top 5 brands that we found included PepsiCo, Mars Incorporated, the Coca-Cola Company, AB InBev, and Mondelez International. So this report includes risk maps, opportunities, and other analysis of the data that will help guide our next steps in going up the chain to talk to those manufacturers about the circularity, and helping some of our folks along the river that don't have good refuse collection and recycling programs to start those programs.
I think that's an incredibly important point that you just made there at the end, Mayor Gallagher. When folks and communities upstream have access to the proper resources to maintain a sustainable and healthy river ecosystem, those benefits then continue on downstream to communities such as Bettendorf. I think that really underscores the importance of working together in coalition with other mayors. I'm also just completely awestruck by the findings of this report. The fact that over 174,000 pieces of refuse were found within the river during the study, and that over 75% of those came from just plastic pollution alone. It's amazing, especially considering when you take a look at some of those top sources of pollution within that category, that cigarette butts and food containers are such an important part of what we are having to deal with in these river ecosystems. So with this in mind, I'd like to ask Representative Phillips, to truly end plastic pollution, we need to address these sources. So can you tell us a little bit more about the pathway, how single-use plastics end up in the community, and how the Delaware General Assembly has worked to address this through legislation such as SB 51?
Yeah, absolutely. So plastics end up in communities simply because they're everywhere at this point and nearly impossible to avoid. They come with deliveries and food packaging in restaurants and so on, as we just heard, from the mayor. Low-income communities deal with plastic pollution even more because they rely on more economical options, which is often packaged in single-use plastic. Also, they're more likely to rely on bottled water because of water quality issues like in Flint, Michigan. More than 90% of the climate pollution that the plastics industry reports to the EPA occurs in just 18 communities, most of which are communities of color. Along with single-use plastic packaging, though, comes styrofoam or polystyrene, which is actually worse than plastic. I know the mayor just mentioned some foam they found as well. So polystyrene is slow to degrade, and if disposed of improperly, the foam can leach chemicals into the environment, harming water sources, and it can leach into our food. Not to mention, polystyrene manufacturing is an enormous creator of hazardous waste, and manufacturing it greatly contributes to global warming. So here in Delaware, we wanted to take a look at where not just single-use plastic was an issue, but also where most of our styrofoam pollution was coming from. Plastic Free Delaware, an amazing advocacy group here in our state, pointed us in the direction of restaurants in particular, and how Delaware businesses were impacting communities with the single-use plastics they use in-house and in the take-home containers we all bring back with us after a meal. We passed SB 51 as a first step. So this act prohibits food food establishments from providing consumers with ready-to-eat food or beverages in polystyrene foam containers or with single-service plastic coffee stirrers, cocktail picks, or sandwich picks. It also prohibits food establishments from providing single-service plastic straws unless requested by a consumer. So I know there's way more to this conversation, like moving completely away from plastic straws, but we needed something that would, one, make a difference quickly, and two, we could get past our General Assembly. We also wanted to be conscious of the impact this law would have on small businesses. We know there are additional costs to this law, and so we made sure these restrictions don't take effect until July 2025. That way, small businesses can budget for the changes and work through the supply they already have. I know the restaurant industry here was really concerned about a lot of businesses just going out of business because of this new law, so we wanted to make sure we took that into account too.
You know, I'm so glad that you mentioned polystyrene in particular, Representative Phillips. I find that this is one of the most pervasive issues when it comes to our campaign for Earth Day 2024 to rid the world of plastic pollution. These materials, as you mentioned, have such an incredible ability to break apart and leach chemicals, just as you mentioned. And when you first told me about SB 51, that was one of the things that excited me the most. As every time that I'm out there on the Potomac River cleaning up pollution, polystyrene is one of the most difficult materials for us to work with and to be able to remove from the environment. But we find that as various municipalities and state governments along the Chesapeake Bay watershed are taking more actions to limit the proliferation and pollution of polystyrene, we're finding less and less of it in our rivers here in DC. And so we really thank you for that. And to go back to what we saw with Mayor Gallagher and the report that the MRCTI put out, Representative Phillips, I'm sure that a lot of the findings in there were very familiar to you, especially when it came to some of the branding associated with the pollution that was found, that there were certain perpetrators, so to speak, that were producing more pollution in the Mississippi River than others. So I want to ask you, what role do plastic producers have in the crisis that affects communities everywhere, as well as the land, water, and air that they depend on? How can legislators take action to ensure extended producer responsibility and protect constituents?
As with most polluting industries, they have a huge role. They started this issue and they can fix it. They need to play a leading role, but currently they're not taking responsibility. Plastic pollution is a classic case of the tragedy of the commons. Plastic producers are currently able to profit from its production, business, and consumers enjoy their low cost, but we're all paying an enormous price for this convenience. Just as in any tragedy of the commons, it's the role of government to change the behavior of producers and consumers, whether that's through pricing or outright bans. And I know we can't solve this crisis without legislative leadership. I know plastic production is rapidly increasing in the US. Unless we enact new laws to require the reduction of plastics, production is expected to double in the next 20 years, according to the World Economic Forum. And this planned expansion would cause increases in air pollution, climate pollution, and plastics, obviously, in the environment and in our bodies, as we mentioned at the beginning. I know my mom lives in New York and is just as much an environmentalist as I am. She spent the past several months lobbying members of New York's General Assembly to pass a bill related to producer responsibility called the Packaging Reduction and Recycling Act. This act aims to reduce packaging by 50% over 12 years. It requires the removal of 12 toxic chemicals from packaging, such as PFAS, lead, cadmium, and bromated flame retardants. And it saves tax dollars by having packaging companies pay fees rather than taxpayers footing the bill for recycling. And I know this act is a spinoff of the New York Extended Producer Responsibility Act. And this program aims to incentivize producers to create packaging that has more recycled content, is more recyclable, and is reusable. It also aims to put New York on the path to achieve its ambitious climate goals. And we have ambitious climate goals here in Delaware. We just passed the Climate Solutions Act recently that set those goals. So I want both of these passed in Delaware, not just in New York. I know as legislators, we often have to look to other states for examples of good policy. I know I'm already learning a lot from Mayor Gallagher and what they're doing there. And to me, this is an example of great policy. What they're doing is an example of great policy. And I want to make sure that we're adopting that, in Delaware and all over the country as well.
It's awesome to hear about the solidarity between local and state governments and the way that each of you can not only learn, but also be able to implement more by working as a united front. It's amazing to hear that extended producer responsibility is finally starting to get the attention it deserves. I want to remind everybody in the audience that as much as you may hear from the fossil fuel and plastic production industries that the pollution crises that we are facing are your fault as an individual, that is a shift of blame. And that it is up to the producers of these toxins to not be polluting the landscapes that we depend on, to keep our land free of debris, to keep our water free of microplastics and other pollution, to keep our air free of toxic chemicals and more. Now that we've reached about the halfway point of our discussion, I'd love to introduce a new segment here on Earth Day Live called Emily on the Mall. As great as it is for us to be here with our policymakers, we also want to hear from the constituents and to understand the relationship between the public interest and how our policymakers are taking action. Emily on the Mall is going to show how folks here in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, feel about issues such as plastic production and pollution. So without any further ado, let's turn it over to our excellent field reporter, Emily, to learn a little bit more about how the public feels about this important issue.
Hey, this is Emily on the Mall, and we're asking people of DC all about plastics. Okay, I'm here with
David.
David. Okay, I have a question for you about plastics. How do you feel about them?
I think that it's good that they can be recycled.
I think it's something we've got to deal with because it's really prolific in our lives, you know, from packaging to, well, I've heard about the microplastics and everything. So something we got to learn to deal with and try to get away with, especially using petrochemicals as well.
I think they have a place for convenience, but yes, they're not a great product as such. In Australia, we don't use plastic straws anymore. In bars or anywhere, you cannot buy a plastic straw.
I mean, when you use it, it's convenient, right? Because in a way, it's like, it works pretty well, like, so it does the job very well. It's like... Totally agree.
Do you know the connection between plastics and climate change?
The connection, I don't know the connection of it, but I'm sure it has some type of effect on the climate.
A lot of people don't understand like the harm it's causing to the environment, and I think there needs to be a greater education exposure throughout the US and the world so that people can understand, because I don't think there's going to be a change to the amount of plastic that we produce and then that gets discarded in landfills and oceans until everyone's made aware of it, and then we'll lobby for change.
It takes a lot of energy to produce the plastics. It takes
oil products,
a lot of energy to recycle and to reuse those plastics, and people frankly just throw it away, and it pollutes oceans and destroys our environments. Yes.
Well, that was interesting. We learned a lot about what people know about plastics. I rate a grade of A- for the people of DC today. They have been doing their homework.
Wow, it is incredible to see just how much some of the folks here on the street know about this issue. It's amazing to see that day by day, year by year, the public is becoming more aware of the issues that are caused by plastic consumption and production. One that really particularly stood out to me was a man who mentioned concerns surrounding microplastics, which are often consumed from our drinking water. The Mississippi River is a major source of drinking water and jobs for millions of Americans. So, Mayor Gallagher, how can municipal plastics initiatives lead to improved public health and economic prosperity for the Mississippi River community?
Well, as you know, we have 20 million folks who drink from the surface water of the Mississippi River. So cleaning that water costs money. And if we can remove some of those particles from the water before we have to clean it so that it is drinkable, we're in a great position. But removing those chemicals that you're talking about and the microplastics is very, very difficult. Some really can't even be removed. And there's a huge economic impact along the river as well due to this plastic pollution that we're fighting together. And a recent article from the University of Michigan stated that the United States lost $255 million in revenue due to plastic pollution in 2018. And the polluted waters around some of our cities certainly can cause real estate prices in those areas to drop, commonly around 25%. I know firsthand the cost of waste management as a member and the chair of the Waste Commission of Scott County, where Bettendorf is located. This commission has a nationally known state-of-the-art materials recovery facility. The recycling commodity markets, as in the value of the markets where the recycling items are sold, are now dependent on the value of recycled plastics, which fluctuate with oil and gas prices, amplifying revenue uncertainty. Marginalized communities are disproportionately bearing the cost of the plastic life cycle, as we talked about. Incineration plants and oil and gas refineries are built predominantly in low-income and marginalized communities, exposing them to health and economic risks, and a lot of those are by the river, so we're also seeing the leakage into the river. Our freshwater economy on the Mississippi generates over $450 billion in annual revenue, and drinking water security, manufacturing, agriculture, and tourism all depend on clean, fresh water. Plastic waste continues to present a danger to our freshwater economy for the reasons we've talked about. We recognize the value of our monumental waterway, and it physically shapes our communities. It's a staple of our economy and an asset to the environment. That's why 103 of us working across party lines, across state lines, work together to try to solve these issues. In fact, our new partnership with Replenish is going to allow us to go back up the chain to those manufacturers, because they all have in their policies, or at least a lot of them now have recycled content goals. So they're going to want to fulfill those goals and allow us to help them with that information that we talked about earlier, have these materials brought back to the recyclers and back through the recyclers to the manufacturers, and find other ways to help spread the responsibility of managing these valuable materials. Right now, it's those of us who are working in our small and medium-sized city up and down the river, but bearing the brunt of cleaning the plastic and other trash and recyclables out of our rivers.
Wow. Your initiatives, Mayor Gallagher, I think are perhaps one of the best embodiments of our campaign to invest in our planet that I've ever heard.
Oh, good.
Something that's really important for us to note is that when we call on folks to invest in our planet, this isn't just something that we're doing for the sake of providing sustainability, to provide security, and to provide safety for folks, but rather this is also an opportunity to save costs and create economic prosperity. This is one of the most unifying pieces of rhetoric that we have to ensure that folks of all backgrounds, stakeholders of all natures, are able to be part of these solutions and feel empowered to make a change, not only just out of survival, but out of opportunity as well. So you mentioned that this is something that is unifying folks across party lines, across industries. It's amazing to see, and we hope to see more of that in communities, not just in the Mississippi River, but across the nation and across the world. This is how we pave a better future for all communities, especially those who are on the front lines of environmental issues. Those who often have the least to do with the existence of pollution in their communities are those who face the brunt of its impacts. Now, Representative Phillips, you have a strong record of standing up for these vulnerable communities across a range of environmental issues. How are frontline communities impacted by plastic production and pollution?
Well, first, I mentioned that Delaware passed the Climate Solutions Act first, right? I wanted to address the climate change question that was on the ground on the mall. So the Climate Solutions Act sets aggressive greenhouse gas goals for our state, and we have to acknowledge the impact that plastics have on emissions. So throughout their life cycle, plastics have a significant carbon footprint, and they emit 3.4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. They're starting to be known as a new coal. By 2030, emissions from plastics will surpass those from coal-fired power plants in the US. To address our goals in Delaware, I know we have to address the production and pollution of plastics. So I have a diverse district. Some areas are home to middle-class families, and some areas are low-income and Section 8. I can see stark differences between my communities, even ones that are separated by only a few blocks. Climate change is impacting the low income areas more. We see it every day. They have a greater amount of impervious surfaces and fewer green spaces and trees, and this makes them hotter and more susceptible to flooding. Delaware is the lowest lying state as well, so the flooding issue is really important here. They're going to feel the effects, continuously as climate change goes on if we don't change our behavior and if we don't force plastic producers to take responsibility for the mess that they started. To correctly address climate change, we're going to have to significantly reduce or eliminate our usage of plastics. In addition to climate change issues influenced by plastics, we also see increased health issues in areas that use a lot of plastic. So studies have found higher healthcare bills related to diseases caused by exposure to toxic chemicals present in plastics, and more hospital visits related to this in low-income communities. Our hospitals in Delaware are mirroring this. Part of my job as a representative of my community is to make sure I'm correctly educating people on proper disposal of plastic and proper usage. I know many people heat up food in their plastic containers, which causes harmful chemicals to leak into their food, and too much exposure leads to cancer, diseases, and other harmful health impacts. So we need to do what we can to protect our community until safer options are more readily accessible to everyone. So you see, like right off the bat, lower income communities are using more plastic. They're often located next to petrochemical industries, and we need to make sure that we're understanding the environmental justice issues of this and correctly addressing it, not just at the state level or the local level, but we really need to be looking at it at the federal level as well.
Wow, you nailed it. That is exactly what we like to hear when we discuss any environmental issue here on Earth Day Live. Something that I think is really evident from what Representative Phillips has shared with us here is the intersectionality between issues, not just between environmental issues, but other social issues as well. The fact that when we see frontline communities impacted by plastic pollution, that also puts them on the front lines of so many public health crises. Whether that comes from the manufacturing of plastics that can lead to higher rates of asthma and other respiratory diseases, or whether that is from plastic pollution leaching chemicals into water that lead to all sorts of bodily illness. Furthermore, the fact that Representative Phillips was able to link plastic pollution and climate change, I think, is a really important note. Surprisingly, many people are unaware of the fact that plastics are indeed petrochemicals, that they are derived from fossil fuels, that there is a clear link between the fossil fuel industry and the plastic production industry. Something that really came to the forefront yesterday when tens of thousands of people flooded the streets of New York for the March to End Fossil Fuels, an incredible moment of activism where folks from all over North America streamed into New York City to demand that our elected leaders and our stakeholders that are leading the way make climate change a priority, to make ending fossil fuels a priority. And yes, many of the protesters there had advocacy points in mind, on their signs, in their mouths, and in their hearts, stating that plastic pollution must be ended for us to truly see an end to fossil fuels. It really was incredible to see, and I can't wait to be part of the next march in person. So, Representative Phillips, from what you've learned from interacting with these frontline communities and from what you've seen from marches like the March to End Fossil Fuels, how has public opinion and activism influenced government actions and on plastic pollution? How has it created change that makes real benefit to communities?
Honestly, advocacy is everything. I know in Delaware, we have a bunch of different environmental groups. I know I mentioned Plastic Free Delaware. We also have Sierra Club, Del Nature Society. We have all these groups that partner together to come to Legislative Hall and make sure that we're well aware of what they need. So I mentioned the Climate Solutions Act a couple of times now. That only happened because of those environmental groups. They worked so hard to come to Leg Hall several times in the session. We're only January through June session. So there's really not that many months. And they were there, I think, every single month, making sure that people knew that the Climate Solutions Act was coming, exactly what it would do, and to make sure that they could answer any questions to ensure that it would pass. So I know that just in Delaware, we have policies that are passing because of these groups. The Climate March in New York City is a great example of how when people rally together, their voices are, more connected, more heard, and they really get to us as legislators because we're here for our constituents. We are not going to be reelected if we don't listen. We are going to, have to work harder if we want a job and if we want to keep our constituents happy and if we want to keep them healthy as well. So I really think something like the Climate March is impeccable. It's joining your voices together to make sure that we understand what you need. And we have all the resources at this point to be able to address climate change. We really just need the motivation to do it. And I think that, climate marches, advocacy groups, making sure you're going to your legislators, calling them, keeping ahead of legislation that's in your state or locally is a really great way of making sure that we're using our voices to make a difference.
Wow, really well said. It's really evident, I think, to all of us here on the panel that advocacy is the key to making sure that our elected officials are representing the constituency properly, especially when it comes to these issues that have such a profound impact on the health, wealth, and prosperity of communities that you represent. So what do you think, Mayor Gallagher? How does advocacy play a role in local government? As a mayor, what kind of interactions do you have with your constituents when it comes to public health and environmental issues?
I think over the 12 years that I've been mayor, those interactions have increased, and people do see some of these issues that may be rooted in international or national discussions that can be solved at a more local level. The mayors of the Mississippi have submitted a response to the EPA's national strategy on plastic pollution, mostly formed by our constituencies, the folks who we talk to each and every day, whether it's a pothole in the street or their concern for the pollution on the riverfront. As mayors of the Mississippi River, we are asserting our commitment and reaffirming the crucial role of local level governments in holistically addressing the plastic pollution crisis and some of these other crises we've been talking about. But specifically here, plastic pollution, we're going to continue to try to address that through circular economy approach by a blended responsibility of the manufacturers, the retailers, the consumers, and the public sector actors. I think we all have a role to play, and I think our constituents who talk to us on a daily basis have great ideas for each one and the role that they ought to play. Right now, the brunt of the responsibility lies with our local governments and therefore the taxpayers. It's unbalanced. It's not a sustainable approach. So local governments can lead the way now, that like the MRCTI is doing, in my opinion, but larger partnerships that broaden the responsibility, enlist more expertise, and rely on a new policy and technology ultimately reduce the reliance and concentration on plastic waste throughout our society and our economy. But we all have to play a role. So it's really been more prevalent recently, I think, as people have continued to learn of the problem, and our work in our communities, like asking people to volunteer to go out with the plastic pollution tracker and track what you see and then clean it up, of course, brings some awareness to our community and starts to encourage people to do a better job of policing one another. Hey, don't toss that over there, and maybe picking it up, making sure that we're recycling properly and relying on our world-class facility. So the constituencies that talk to us also can take an active role, just as you've talked about in activism, but also at a local level and helping to clean the environment and clean our cities.
It's amazing. That almost sounds like citizen science too. I know my background is in environmental science, and we always tell people to get involved at the local level, even with science, so they get a better understanding of what we're doing, and so they gain an interest in it. So I'm really excited to hear that, they have that opportunity, and I really want to bring that to Delaware. So like I said, I'm learning a lot just from being on this. And
open source information. You can pick it up right now. Go to MRCTI debris tracker, and you can start using it today.
I love it. I'm actually definitely going to do that starting as soon as possible. I did also want to mention I'm the youngest right now in the Delaware House, and there are a couple of people running in Delaware right now that are 3 years younger than me and who are my age right now. And I think a big reason of mentioning that is a lot of the climate issues are going to be faced by young people. We're going to be the ones around when we see the worst of climate change. A lot of us are, debating whether or not we want to have kids because of the climate change issue. So I think it says a lot that young people are now starting to run for office in local elections, state and federally too. I know we saw Max Frost federally as well. So I think it makes a big difference. If you are a young person and you really do want to get involved, run for office. It is tough, but we're doing it, and our voices really do matter, and it's time for us to finally be involved in conversations, at those levels.
Absolutely. In some ways, it's even beyond time. I think it's incredible to see more and more folks from our generation stepping up into these types of leadership roles, especially those in elected office. I absolutely can endorse that position, and I can't wait to see those campaigns unfold. Just as Representative Phillips said, it's young people who are going to be around for those extreme climate impacts, and it's up to us to be able to advocate for the future that we want to be a part of. But the best part is that you don't necessarily have to hold a seat in public office in order to be that leader. I love that initiatives like the ones that Mayor Gallagher and the MRCTI have been working on together, that allows everybody to be elevated to a leader in their community, to be able to not just participate as a volunteer picking up a piece of trash, which is always great, always awesome, you should do that, but being able to then contribute to citizen science, contribute to important data that leads to advocacy, to not just pick up a piece of plastic, but also pick up the phone and call your mayor. If they're anything like our good Mayor Gallagher here, you're going to be listened to. Your voice is going to be heard. And together, when we all take just that next step towards leadership, it makes a huge difference. In fact, if everyone who holds these values in their heart were active the way that we see folks like those we've just mentioned do so, the world would be a vastly different place. The Environmental Voter Project estimates that there are millions of Americans out there who claim to support environmental causes, to recognize that those are the issues that our legislators should be focusing on, yet those millions of individuals don't turn out for every election. If we saw everybody just take that one step towards civic responsibility, takes just a few moments of your day to register to vote, we'll see incredible change. We'll see more folks like Mayor Gallagher and Representative Phillips be elected into office, leading the way towards change for communities everywhere. With that in mind, I'd love to open it up to all of the wonderful leaders here in the audience today. We'd love to get into the Q&A now. I see that Sarah Davies asks, how do we get all mayors to get involved in this amazing framework? Is it bipartisan? Mayor Gallagher, I know that you mentioned some really exciting bipartisan efforts happening, and I know you have some experience with getting mayors to cooperate. Do you want to take this question?
Yes, I'd be happy to. For 12 years, the MRCTI has worked across party lines, across state lines, and we are solving problems. Sometimes we have to have longer discussions about some area of a work plan and why it might be important. For instance, we can talk to my Republican friends and say, look at the amount of money we will save if we attack this plastic pollution problem. And yet you could talk to my Democrat friends and say, look at the environmental consequences of the work that we're doing in this area. There's always a fiscal responsibility piece to most of the things that we do. And we can find those pieces and work together on projects that might feel one way or the other on a political spectrum. So this is a great example of 103 mayors that work together. There's a great example in the Chesapeake Bay area. There's a great example in the Great Lakes area. So we have associations of mayors in this country working together across political lines, doing great work at the local level.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Mayor Gallagher, for giving some more insight into how we can activate each and every mayor. Joshua Broyle asks, do we know how public opinion and activism influence government actions on plastics these past years? I'll leave this open to either of you to answer.
I mean, I can answer for Delaware just because I'm on the state level. I know in Delaware, the only reason that we're able to get a lot of our bills passed that are environmentally based are because of public opinion and activism. With SB 51, that was the styrofoam and single-use plastic ban. That was primarily Plastic Free Delaware doing the lobbying, for us. They came to us with a bill initially that, they always look a little bit different when you get a bill and we have to edit it and make sure that we can get it past the General Assembly. But those initial stages of, a group or even an individual bringing a bill to us about something they care about really goes a long way. So with, SB 51, I know we're looking at a couple of other plastic related policies. They were brought to us also by Plastic Free Delaware and actually by some local local council members as well in my county. So I think we can see it just on the state level how much public opinion and activism does influence government action. And like I mentioned before, we want to get elected again. So if we're hearing from our constituents that they care about plastics and they care about environmental issues, then we have to act. So I think we have been able to see, you know, at least this past year for me, how it's been able to influence our policy.
Yeah, it sounds clear to me that public opinion and activism are really where this process starts. It's that seed that grows into the legislation that comes back and supports communities and fulfills those advocacy goals in the end. And it's amazing to see how these grow into fruits that plant seeds for new growth as well. That the actions that have happened in places like Delaware are creating change all around the world. I think that there's no secret that the reason why we've seen so many countries begin to all take action on single-use plastics over just the last couple of years is this chain reaction where as more and more legislation gets passed, it further influences public opinion, shows advocates that change is possible, and leads to further advocacy in other communities. And I think we're really starting to see the tides turn on plastic pollution as a result. Now, Sean Stewart asks, microfiber cloths are incredibly useful, but their introduction to the environment has devastating consequences. What's the alternative? Mayor Gallagher or Representative Phillips, have either of you encountered any alternatives to microfiber cloths and other forms of synthetic fibers, whether those are in clothes or otherwise?
Go ahead, Sophie. You look like you're about to say something, Sophie.
I mean, I just seeing this question pop up, I'm like quickly Googling it because off the top of my head, like, no, I can't think of anything. And it's hard having to shop and knowing that there's plastics in literally everything and how we can avoid them. So honestly, thank you for this question because now I'm on like a Google black hole trying to find this. So Mayor Gallagher, if you have an answer, go for it.
You know, I don't think that there are comparable products right now on the market. And that's one of the things that a powerful organization like the MRCTI, representing those 10 states and 37, the watershed reaches 37 states and 2 Canadian provinces. So there's some power in that lobby when we go to DC. There's some power in that lobby when we talk to manufacturers and retailers. Coming up with alternatives is a great conversation for those who use the product that we'd like to change, and finding ways with our partners at the manufacturing stage, at the retail stage, so that we can bring a new product to market. And if there has to be a subsidy, maybe that's where the government comes in. But there's got to be a way to have partnerships and work with these folks in a manner to find solutions that work for everybody. We struggle at this local grassroots level to legislate everything. We don't have that authority in many cases. And we see these folks at the grocery store. And we know that when we start to legislate things, that affects those economies and affects those jobs. So this is a very intricate woven system of issues that need to be balanced through priorities. And it's really about cooperation that I think we've learned through our 12 years in business, that finds those solutions and keeps everybody on the same page. It's about cooperation and building partnersps for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to jump in really quickly.
Did you find one?
I did. I found something. The terry cloth towels are an alternative, but they're more expensive. So I do want to address that a little bit too, that alternatives are going to be a bit more expensive. So I know the Mayor mentioned subsidies and how, you know, as government, we can try and help get these alternatives out there and more easily accessible. But I know too, I just attended a conference with a bunch of different state legislators all over the country. And it was primarily about PFAS and how we can, you know, correctly address PFAS and create alternatives to make sure that we're not leaching more PFAS than we already have into our environment. And I think the same needs to be addressed with different sorts of materials like microfiber towels and things like that. So I think, you know, having these big, like you mentioned, partnerships with states or local governments or even advocacy groups, I think is a really great way to make sure that we're putting our heads together and, you know, coming up with alternatives and then forcing the producers to make sure that they're making those instead of these harmful, you know, materials.
Yeah, I think it's really cool that both of you have honed in on a couple of really important points when it comes to the sustainable and just transition towards the materials that we need to see in consumer goods. It's going to require a combination of cooperation with producers and incentives for them to make these changes, while at the same time enforcing new regulations that will further push these organizations towards making the right choice for our consumers. I think that it all comes together really interestingly. I think that the way that you described Mayor Gallagher as being woven is the perfect way to describe the issue of plastic textiles. In particular, when it comes to these problems, it's an issue that, as both of you mentioned, there are lots of problems when it comes to education around the materials and the availability. That's why we want folks to visit earthday.org's Fast Fashion campaign, where we are discussing all of the information that you need to know to make healthy consumer choices and understand where the industry is going towards more sustainable textiles. Now, I'd like to bring up Tom Cosgrove's question. How aware are your constituents of the health impacts of plastic? What are the most effective ways for people to get the word out and get legislation towards solutions? It's a great follow-up to our discussion on just what do people know about these issues.
I mean, I know a lot of my constituents that live in those wealthier areas are aware because they have access to more information. You know, they have internet, they have all these fancy devices where they can learn, but I want to spend a lot more time in the areas of my district that are more low income and Section 8, because that's where I see a lot of those health impacts. I know that they don't have access to other sorts of materials to be able to heat their food. They get takeout often because it ends up being cheaper for them over time. So I think we have to do a better job at educating everybody and not just assuming that everybody has, you know, these little devices that we can turn to and find out all this information. So I think on the ground, you know, grassroots campaigns are good for that. I know we try to partner with community groups. Like we have our Latin American Center that does a really great job at getting the word out, not just about, you know, issues like this, but also possible legislation and how to lobby. I think that's a big part of it. You know, we hear from people who know how to lobby and know what that means, but we don't get to hear from a lot of our constituents that are actually dealing with these issues. So I think it's, you know, Mayor Gallagher mentioned a lot about partnerships. I think it's a lot about partnering with local community groups who have access to every single, you know, avenue of our communities to make sure that we're getting the word out and, you know, educating on how to lobby and how to make sure we're, as legislators, hearing what we need to hear from them.
I think that the idea that we address accessibility and equitability is so powerful. So I like hearing that there are elected leaders like you that care to make sure that their constituents are heard, not just by providing like an open forum, but providing resources and training so that everybody knows how to be a successful advocate. That is democracy in action. And it's incredible to see. I think if we had more of that, then it would be a lot easier for these communities who are actually feeling the health impacts of environmental issues, whether it be plastic pollution or climate related. When their voices are heard, it would be a lot harder for some of your colleagues to tune out those voices. I know you do a great job of listening, both of you.
Evan, I got a little something to add, if I may.
Please go ahead.
I think this topic is important for us at the MRCTI, at the mayor level, as we look forward. And I hear it's very important, of course, with Representative Phillips and the work that she's doing. I think the vast majority of people don't have much knowledge about any awareness or worry of any health effects, as the question was posed. I think there's more knowledge in the community about the litter portion of what we're doing. So here in the Quad Cities, in partnership with the MRCTI, our entire bi-state region, an MSA of about 450,000 people, in cooperation with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, in partnership with our EPA and this MRCTI group, as I talked about, are building awareness about the flow of litter downstream to the ocean and those effects, especially of the microplastics that we ingest. We've deployed litter capture devices. We collect that litter. I talked about the program with the tracker, and we're putting on workshops here and in Toronto, Canada, as well as Chiapa de Corzo in Mexico. So the three cities are working on providing that information, showing what that tracker device did, removing the litter from our creeks and our streams before it hits the river, and showing those effects of the removal and the possible health and side effects if we don't act now. So we have some boots on the ground things that can be replicated throughout the river corridor and throughout the nation or world. That's why we're working with our friends in Canada and in Mexico. That's just one example of getting the word out, but there's a practical application to it as well. So the more those things can happen, the more educated our public will become.
Wow. It's incredible to see the international cooperation that's going on there. Because as you mentioned, it's going to take widespread cooperation and education in order for us to be able to see an entire ecosystem like the Mississippi River watershed become as healthy as we seek it to be. If everybody is able to do their part, facilitated through programs such as ones that you've mentioned today, I think we'll get there. All right, and so we have one more question to round out our Q&A now. How do politics influence the development and implementation of extended producer responsibility programs for plastics? I'll leave this open to either of you, but let's start with Representative Phillips, since you've had some great thoughts tonight surrounding EPR.
Yeah, politics plays a huge role in this. I know we've had issues, on the state level with SB 51, making sure that we're getting these things passed. It takes a lot of lobbying to the Republican side as well, even more than it does the Democratic side. I think seeing the New York law and watching what my mom had to deal with, it looks like the petrochemical industry has kind of alternatives that sound great, but it's really greenwashing. But they'll sell these like greenwashing tools as a better option than actually this EPR idea. So I think as activists and as legislators, you have to be aware of companies bringing other ideas that might sound great on paper, but you actually have to look into them a little more closely to recognize that a lot of them are just greenwashing. They're pretty words, but they don't actually solve the issue. So I think that's kind of where you're going to see those politics pop up when you see these other industries try to come in with other solutions that aren't that great. And then the other side will say, oh, well, this industry, like, why wouldn't they have a great idea? Like, we're going to listen to them. So it's a lot of trying to get people to get to the facts and to get to the actual statistics of how these things work. And I think that's really hard in politics. A lot of people will go with just anecdotes, and that's how they vote. They don't really take a look at those inner, understandings and facts and science. So it's definitely an issue that we have to deal with on the daily. And like I said, I watched my mom deal with it in New York, and I wish I could remember what their solution was, the petrochemical industry solution was. If I think of it, I'll throw it in the comments. But yeah, politics definitely plays a huge role in this.
And yet, if there's a way to remove politics, 103 of us have pretty much successfully done so. I think it's a problem-solving solution. I don't see that at our state level either, Representative Phillips, and we certainly don't see it at the national level, in my opinion. But I think it's the mayors whose boots are on the ground, who have dinner with constituents, who see them in the grocery store, at the gas pump. We hear about those things, and then we attempt to problem solve so things are better for all of us. And I'd encourage us to make sure that we're looking at the chain and the circularity of the chain. Talk to these folks. We've got great meetings with PepsiCo, Walmart. All these folks are using the products. If we can convince them to hit their green targets and removal targets of this type of product, then the producers produce less, right? We can certainly go to the producer, but that's a product that they're making money on. And right now, they're making a lot of money on it. But if nobody buys it, they're not making money on it. They'll go to something else. There are ways, multiple ways to skin this cat. I'd encourage you to continue to think out of the box, rely on the local elected officials and the folks who really believe that this work is important, because I think we can make a difference.
And that's exactly why we need high quality elected officials like both of you. And Representative Phillips, it looks like you have something else to add there.
Chemical recycling, that's what they call it. So I don't know too much about it, but look into that. That's what the petrochemical industry is using.
Right. And I think that leads to one bonus question that I'd love to ask, and I'm hoping we can make a quick part of our conversation here, which is recycling. How do each of you feel this plays a role in the plastic pollution crisis? Should we be taking a stronger stance towards or away recycling as part of the solution to plastic pollution?
I mean, in my household, we recycle just because that's been ingrained in us. And I know that plastic industry really talked a lot about recycling because it puts the responsibility on the individual as opposed to the producer. And I know, in Delaware, we are really bad at recycling. Even if we as individuals recycle, it all goes to a location that's not really regulated and it ends up all in a landfill. So it's really frustrating because, I think recycling can do a lot if it's done correctly, but I don't think, at least in our state, I don't think we do this, nationally either. I don't think we do it well. So I think a big piece of this issue is going to come from producers and just stopping the use of plastic, or at least, greatly reducing it. I don't think that it should be our responsibility as individuals to make sure that, where do we can always do our part, but I just really think that we have to put a lot of the responsibility back on the producers for, creating this stuff and forcing us to take that responsibility.
Well said.
But I think it's part of the solution, and I think that there's certainly room for other parts of the solution. I think we've talked about it a lot, but we really believe that any local, national, international goal in this area must be in collaboration with manufacturers, retailers, consumers, and government, all empowered to be part of that solution. We certainly need some source reduction of single-use plastics through education, awareness, maybe incentives. We need to prevent plastic litter by improved solid waste and management and infrastructure that we're working on. We've got to expand the circularity with an emphasis on local benefits so we can see those benefits. We probably need some incentives to spur and grow markets for our post-consumer waste materials, that recycling, because I think it still has to be part of the solution. And we're open to common sense policies focused on decreasing the use and distribution of single-use plastics, strengthening litter reduction and prevention, and implementation of consistent reporting and tracking of waste diversion to ensure accountability and to build trust in our solid waste and recycling program. So I think that's kind of the package that we continue to sell on the ground as mayors along the corridor. And we're hopeful that we could increase, especially in some of our underserved populations, proper recycling.
Right. I think it's important that both of you noted that there is a place within the solution that recycling exists. However, as both of you noted, it cannot be the end all be all because of some of the significant limitations that ultimately lead to only 6% of plastics that are produced in a given year being recycled and eventually making its way into new product. Clearly, this falls vastly short of an ultimate victory when it comes to achieving true circularity and achieving a zero waste future. And we really rely on the support of elected officials such as yourselves to be able to bridge that gap through policy innovation, through negotiation as well, with the many different stakeholders that it takes to create this holistic picture of sustainability. We need stakeholders of all backgrounds to do their part in our transition to a sustainable future. Elected officials, especially those at your city and state levels, have some of the greatest capacity to limit plastic production, to prevent its consumption, and to remediate the pollution that permeates our landscape and poisons our water and air. This is why for Earth Day 2024, we've chosen the theme of planet versus plastics. Because together, when we stand up as advocates, as volunteers, and as intersupportive community members, that's what it's going to take for us to break free of plastic pollution and move down the path towards a sustainable future. I thank both of you as panelists for taking the time to join us today. You have been incredibly insightful, and I know I've learned a lot. I hope that all of you in the audience have as well. And we can't wait to see you next time for Earth Day Live this coming October. Thank you so much. Have an excellent day. And remember, it's time to end plastic pollution. Thank you.